Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Tech Accessibility Mini Summit. This will be a recurring event almost every month on the 15th. Stay tuned for more. My name is Raita. I'm a brown woman with caramel hair, wearing starry gold earrings, a Christmassy sweater, which I called an ugly Christmas sweater, but I kind of like it, blue jeans, and black boots. Our conference is spelled A11y, which is an abbreviation for accessibility. It's more compact for the character limits on social media. The 11 in the middle stemmed from conventions in software engineering and communication technology that shortened long words by substituting the middle letters with the number of the middle letters instead. So there are 11 letters between A and Y, so accessibility becomes A11y. And there are more examples like this. For example, O11y, which stands for observability, K8S, which is Kubernetes. That's pretty cool, huh? So coincidentally, accessibility, A11y, looks like it would read phonetically as ally, which has been the topic of controversy in some circles on social media. However, many technologies do see accessibility as a movement and not just the simple act of making websites more accessible. Please be mindful that we have a code of conduct, which you can find on our website, tech.a11y.dev/code of conduct. Please be considerate and inclusive about communication in chat on our YouTube channel. Having said that, let's start with our first speaker. Derk-Jan Karrenbeld, DJ, not a stranger to the tech community. He's a business owner of 2 tech startups, a business consultancy, and music technology. He's a hands-on programmer. I know him from the JavaScript and Ruby community, very famous there. But most of all, he's an excellent karaoke singer. So I know him as the queen of karaoke. Today, Derk-Jan will talk about these accessibility events where we always try to make things more accessible. But today, we'll actually experience some of the inaccessibilities. DJ, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Raita. Well, I am ready, so I would like to start by sharing my screen, which I'm going to do right now. And then we can get started. If you're watching this at home or at work, and you're having discomfort with the black screen and the white text, or you have motion sickness in any form or shape, you can go to talks.derkjan.com and actually find this talk, and it will adhere to your color preference and reduced motion. All right, here we go. Raita did a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. I am not brown. I am dulce de leche because my mom's from Suriname. My dad is Dutch. And as Raita said, I am well known in her circles because I often speak on Ruby tech meetups about various subjects such as accessibility, but also very hardcore and hard coding problems. You can find me on Twitter as Sleepless Byte. Please note that depending on your Twitter settings, that may not be safe for work. And you can find me on GitHub and GitLab also as Sleepless Byte. My main company is called Delft Solutions, and we are a Dutch software agency for consultancy, custom software, and more. You can read something on our website if you'd like. But I would like to dive quickly into what it is that we do to give you some context for today's talk. Over the past few years, we've built a COVID-19 scanner for businesses to reunite teams. We are in safety and compliance management software. We built a social network for medical professionals. We build movie trailer recognition inside cinema apps. We do hit prediction for upcoming artists. And for 17 universities and colleges in the Netherlands, we built their digital companion for their introductory period. Those softwares and web applications may sound like they have nothing in common, but they actually have two things in common. One is I worked on them, and the second thing is that they're all meant to be used by people. And so normally, I give this talk to groups of programmers. And these groups of programmers often have never heard about how to implement accessibility at all. But of course, today you're watching this on an accessibility event. So you've already taken some steps to be more accessible. That said, even when I ask my friends and colleagues who are in accessibility space, especially those that are more able-bodied, actually don't know what it's like to have trouble browsing the web and using everyday applications. And so today, I'm not going to give you a checklist of all these things that you should do, and I'm not going to give you the 5 myths and debunk them, because those talks exist. And you can Google them. You can also tweet at me or find me on GitHub, and I will happily provide you links to very good talks. But this talk is not it. Today, I would like to spark your interest to make your first accessible and purposely inclusive change if you haven't done so, or give you some tools or some way of conversing to those who think accessibility isn't that important, so that you may change their mind as well. Now, for me, the best way to advocate for this is to actually experience it. If you're watching this talk back later and you actually want to do this at home, or you want to do this in your company, you can click this link and complete the Accessibility Developer Guide setup, which I've already done. So we don't need to do that. And I'm going to give you a small backstory before we're going to experience a microsite that I made for this talk. So imagine you've just moved and you want to make friends, and therefore you want to sing your heart out at karaoke. So what you're going to be looking at is a community status page. Unfortunately, in the last 5 minutes, when you set up your computer, you hit your head and a tree got into your eye, and now for temporary purposes, you can't see anymore. But luckily, you followed the Accessibility Developer Guide and you installed a screen reader.
Jobs.
Link. Mainland. Toolbar. talks.derkjan.com/talks/practically accessible microsite/looks fine number run. Selection removed. Practically accessible. This example page looks fine. Heading level 3.
A11y.Lowlands status page. Below you'll find status information for each of the various activities and services this community provides. We zijn een internationale community en al ons services zijn in het Engels. De statuspagina is daarom ook alleen in het Engels beschikbaar. Kom jer native. Neem dan contact met ons op.
Clickable.
Contact right arrow. Legend.
List with 3 items.
Available. Issue. Outage.
Out of list.
Current status.
Table with 12 rows and 3 columns. Row 1, column 2.
Amsterdam.
Column 3.
Utrecht.
Row 2, column 1.
Website.
Column 2, column 3. Row 3, column 1.
Email.
Column 2, column 3. Row 4, column 1.
Slack.
Column 2, column 3. Row 5, column 1.
YouTube.
Column 2, column 3. Row 6, column 1.
Twitter.
Column 2, column 3. Row 7, column 1.
GitHub.
Column 2, column 3. Row 8, column 1.
Meetup.
Column 2, column 3. Row 9, column 1.
Phone.
Column 2, column 3. Row 10, column 1.
Karaoke.
Column 2, column 3. Row 11, column 1.
Code of conduct.
Column 2, column 3. Row 12, column 1.
Sponsoring.
Column 2, column 3. Out of table. Button.
Turn on site.
Speech mode off.
And so you turn on your screen reader and then you cry a little bit on the inside. Now, if you paid attention, you may have heard the word karaoke, but it's probably absolutely impossible to determine what the status is of the karaoke service in Utrecht. And so you phone a friend and you say, hey, can you help out? I currently can't see. Can you please look on the community status page and see what the current status is? And so we can actually do that. And we can see this very common status page that looks perfectly fine. And your friend tells you, well, you know what? Karaoke in Utrecht, that's available, as it should. So the question that I often ask developers is, how long does it actually take to make the status page, as you just saw, adequately screen reader accessible so that people who may use accessibility tools such as screen readers don't have a horrible time trying to find the answer to the question, is karaoke available in Utrecht? And when I ask this question, I get vastly different answers, but in general, they will give me an estimate between 1 hour and 1 month. And so this morning, when I built this page as 528, I actually timed myself how long it took me to make this less bad. And it took me 430 seconds, which is just over 7 minutes. Now, granted, I do this for a living, so you don't need to be as fast. But what I'm trying to point out is that to go from a page that looks good to a page that looks and works decently well for many more people doesn't need to be a huge time investment. I'm going to talk about a few things that I changed in those 7 minutes, which are listed on the screen right now, but we'll go through them individually. But please note that this is not a checklist. This is not the list of things that you should do to make it better. This is just the 7 things that I will talk about right now because they're very easy to see and very easy to show. So the first thing that you need to know about are landmarks. Landmarks come up whenever you are doing accessibility audits or when you're browsing MDM. Then you're reading about all the different HTML elements that we have. Landmarks are also indicators for screen readers which sections or regions on the page exist. Screen readers in general can browse pages by browsing the various landmarks. And so what we can do, change this div-vis structure to one with a landmark, for example, using a nav element. Then we have headings. Headings go from H1 all the way through H6, and they indicate headings on a page. The majority of accessibility tools, such as screen readers, can also browse pages via headings. They can even generate a table of contents for pages, but when it does this, it is very important that headings make sense. So what does that mean? The first heading on the page should be an H1. And anything that's below that in the hierarchy should be an H2. And anything that's below those H2s should be an H3, etc. And if you do this, then the table of contents makes sense, and screen readers can naturally browse the page much better. Now, when you were listening for that word karaoke in that table, you just heard karaoke column 1, column 2. But when we were looking at the page, we saw a green dot. The problem here is that that green dot that us without any visual impairment can perfectly see isn't announced to the screen reader. So when you have something that's visually represented, you probably want to give the screen reader a textual equivalent. We can do that with a screen reader only styling, which exists in the majority of frameworks, but you can also find very good implementations on the web if you Google for screen reader only content. And by doing this, the screen reader can actually read the green dot as the word available. In the same way, when the screen reader was going over the contact button, it said contact right arrow. The right arrow is purely presentational, and for screen readers it's not very important. Therefore, we can hide things from screen reader by marking them. Then images. When we're looking at images, for us who can see, it's very easy to interpret what it is on the screen. Some images are purely decorational, some images are logos and indicate the name of a company, but it's important that we make that known to screen readers. In this particular case, the logo at the top had no alt attributes, an alternative for when you don't see the image. So the solution here is to add an alt attribute. And then there is the notion of what is current. Going through huge list of navigation, it's very easy to see which item is active if you can use your eyes. But if you can't, we can help a screen reader and other assistive technology by marking such a link as the current page, the current location, the current tab. Just marking it as current, just like we see with our eyes. Now, after I've made all these changes, I publish that page as well. And this time, I'm actually going to show you the page without any blurry vision. Great, the tree is out of your eyes, you've restored. But I will turn on this feature in the screen reader that will allow us to follow along as it reads the various parts of the page. So you can actually hear and see at the same time how the screen reader experiences it and how those who can see the page will experience it. If you want to do this yourself, in NVDA, you go to Preferences, Settings, Vision, and you turn on Enable Highlighting. All right. I hope we are ready.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk. talks.derkjan.com/talks/practically accessible microsite/screen reader. Selection removed. Practically accessible. This example page is not completely inaccessible. Link.
Skip to main content.
Banner landmark visited link graphic A11y.
I'm gonna just do this again because I want the thing to be
Button.
right here.
Button.
Send an email.
Visited link.
Yeah,
Home.
there we go.
Link current page.
Status.
Visited link.
Code of conduct.
Link.
Sponsorships.
Link.
Jobs.
Visited link.
Give a talk.
Visited link.
Contact.
Heading level 1.
Welcome to the A11y.Lowlands status page. Below you'll find status information for each of the various activities and services this community provides.
Main landmark region heading level 2.
Note for Dutch-speaking visitors.
We zijn een internationale community en al onze services zijn in het Engels. Deze statuspagina is daarom ook alleen in het Engels beschikbaar. Kom je er niet uit? Neem dan contact met ons op.
Link.
Contact.
Out of region. The actual status of the services region table with 12 rows and 3 columns caption.
Current status per service. There are 1 issues and 6 outages in total.
Row 1 column 1.
Service.
Column 2.
Amsterdam.
Column 3.
Utrecht.
Row 2 service column 1.
Website.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Outage.
Row 3 service column 1.
Email.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Available.
Row 4 service column 1.
Slack.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Available.
Row 5 service column 1.
YouTube.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Outage.
Row 6 service column 1.
Twitter.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Outage.
Row 7 service column 1.
GitHub.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Outage.
Row 8 service column 1.
Meetup.
Amsterdam column 2.
Available.
Utrecht column 3.
Available.
Row 9 service column 1.
Phone.
Amsterdam column 2.
Outage.
Utrecht column 3.
Outage.
Row 10 service column 1.
Karaoke.
Amsterdam column 2.
Issue.
Utrecht column 3.
Available.
Speech mode off.
we found out that, again, in Utrecht, karaoke is available. I'm going to exit the screen reader now. The 7 minutes of changes have huge impact on people who use accessibility tools. And so you may ask yourself, okay, well, great, I've done these things. So am I done? Well, you're not, because people may not be using assistive technology to browse the website. I'm currently using a mouse, but when I'm on my phone, I'm using touch controls. I know people who use joysticks, and I often also only use the keyboard. And our test page, unfortunately, has this problem that when I use the keyboard and using tab to browse through the page, I can't actually see what I'm doing. So for this, there's a 30-second fix, and that's stop hiding outlines. Now, of course, whenever I tell this to developers, they tell me, well, DJ, my designer hates me if I don't do this. For that, I will redirect you to a wonderful post by Sarah, and it's a guide to designing accessible, compliant focus indicators. She goes in depth about what is good and what is bad, but I will quickly show you an example implementation that actually only took me about 1 minute more to implement. So, are we done? Well, we're not. Question for you, what do 1 in 12 men have in common? And if you said they have some color deficiency, you are right. Right now on the screen, you see various forms of color deficiency. And if at the bottom, it doesn't say the word none, but the two images look the same, I'm sorry to tell you, you are probably colorblind. 1 out of 12 is a lot. And so it is very important that we do 2 things. Number 1 is we experience our design using browser tools. In Chrome and in Firefox and also in Safari, you can do this by going to the developer tools, finding the rendering tab, and then simulating vision deficiencies. Here you have various forms of vision deficiencies, color deficiencies. You can actually experience the page as if you were colorblind. Now, of course, if you're lucky, 1 out of 12 men, you can probably experience this yourself by using the web. The second thing we want to do is make sure that our color contrast is high enough. We can do that in Chrome and also in Firefox by selecting an element, finding the color, and then seeing the contrast ratio displayed in the screen. The contrast ratio tells us how well the contrast is between the text and the background color. And in this case, it's not very good. But we have these nice buttons over here that will give us examples that will make it better. Now, just one caveat, there are some troubles with calculating this contrast ratio, but in a future version of the tool, hopefully they will have implemented a better algorithm. In the graph up here, you can actually also see where the lines are for which below the contrast is too low and above the contrast would be sufficient. Finally, never use color as your only indicator. So you may have been seeing those stoplights on our status page, but it's actually always better to also use iconography to indicate the various values. So how do you know what you're doing is right? And it's a very good question. The best thing to do is to test with real users. There are various companies and various groups all around the world, but also in the Netherlands, that will either provide this for you or you can buy their time and they will help you test with actual users with actual disabilities. There is a brilliant talk by Adrian Bollinio. It's called Testing Web Accessibility. He goes in depth about various tools that you can use to automatically test your web applications or native apps. But please remember that less than 50% of all issues can be automatically detected. So testing with real users is still very important. The third option is to use developer tools such as Polypane, which we actually use at our company. Polypane has at least 80 built-in tools and checks for accessibility. And if you can actually see the animation on the screen right now, it's indicating various color contrasts on a page and which colors would actually make the color contrast sufficient. And finally, you can follow the Accessibility Developer Guide, which I mentioned before, the Area Authoring Practices Guide, which goes in depth about design patterns and examples, using area landmarks, providing accessible names and description, and everything else that I haven't covered. And if you are going to implement this in your company or in your personal product, and you're going to ask for an audit, an accessibility audit, most likely they will follow the international standard how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities, the WCAG. This is mentioned throughout a lot of resources, and thus it's a very good idea to just follow those practices. It's very readable, and I highly recommend it. Now, the final part of this talk and the last 3 minutes that I want to spend is to answer this question. How do I convince my colleague, my boss, my client to become more accessible? And the hard answer is you don't. It's a very hard thing to say, but I've been in many situations where I've advocated for more accessibility, and that's where it stays. It was just me advocating. If you're an employee and you've tried to convince your manager or your boss and you don't get the buy-in, don't drive yourself crazy. Don't burn yourself out. It's okay. If you're in the position to, you can leave. There are plenty of companies these days that actually do care about implementing accessibility. If you're a client, you should absolutely expect more from the company that you are paying to build your applications, because you want your tool to be used by as many people as possible. So the more inclusive it is, the more people it can use. And finally, for those bosses who are trying to cut corners, stop trying to compete with those companies. You may say, well, DJ, this example status page was very contrived, except that it wasn't. This morning, I checked the status pages of a lot of the big companies, including Dropbox, Google Cloud Services, AWS, Atlassian, and even Slack. And they all had various minor to very major accessibility issues, the same that you've experienced today on the status page. The same problems that are actually very easy to fix. If you need more convincing, in 2025, we will have to adhere to the European Accessibility Act, which will make it law to be accessible if whatever you're building is meant for public consumption. Well, I'm not going to do that. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, there's already precedent in the United States. The American Disability Act is being enforced. You'll likely lose in court. Domino's Pizzas has lost a case where someone couldn't order a pizza on their website. And it's very likely that we'll find exactly the same legal things happening over here once it becomes into effect. Finally, just realize that it's unprofessional. It's unprofessional to not be inclusive and accessible. We don't ask our surgeons, well, can you please wash your hands before you cut into me? Because that would be unprofessional. And in the same way, it is unprofessional to not deal with inclusivity, to not be accessible, to not advocate for those who need advocating for. And so if you need any more convincing, just tell yourself, this is part of my job. Now, I have one more thing to say. There is this brilliant quote by Tim Berners-Lee, basically the founder of the World Wide Web, that ties into everything that I've said thus far. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And I want to leave you with that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very,
I don't hear you yet, just so you know.
Oh. No, I'm unmuted.
I still don't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Nope.
Do we have the microphone? Okay. DJ. Okay. All right, let's see if we can find a microphone. DJ cannot hear me.
Do you want me to call in again?
I'm just looking at tech. Hank, our tech guy. It should work. Let me double check.
For those watching, we're having slight technical difficulties. Reita can hear me perfectly fine, but I cannot hear her.
Yes, let's see if we can fix this. And unmute. So I tried turning it off and on again. DJ, nothing. Still nothing.
I can see your mouth move.
I know. Do we have a microphone we can use? Oh. Okay. So let's see. Okay, we're gonna do it the old-fashioned way. I know that DJ and I have phone numbers, so I'll try sending him a message. And he's calling in again. You.
Oh.
Hi, DJ. You gotta love technology, right?
Oh, I love it. Love it, love it, love it.
Well, thank you so much for this very, very important talk about accessibility. And I absolutely agree with you that companies should try to be as inclusive as possible, for sure.
Yeah.
Because you never know who is on the other side of the screen, right?
Yes.
So I do have a question for you regards to the screen reader. Is this actually how folks listen to the web, or are there any other options or possibilities?
Yeah, so I know a few people who use screen readers on the daily, and this is not how they listen, because we just listen on it on easy mode. These are the default settings when you install NVDA on Windows. They listen to this on like 2x or 3x or 4x speed. Oh. And they'll even turn off speech on certain occasions, and they'll just listen to the different types of beeps that the tool makes in order to navigate pages. It's fascinating, and it truly does feel like magic seeing someone use it. Some people, actually one person that I know, he uses a Braille screen, which is, well, we know what Braille looks like, right? Like those dots that send out. This is great. NVDA can actually also generate this for you on the screen, so you can actually see this. But what it will do is it will take whatever we listen to and then turn it into Braille, so people can feel and then just read the page, which makes it even more important that whatever you put on the page is well, content that makes sense. There are people who use voice commands to control the page. So they won't use a mouse or they won't use a keyboard, they actually use voice commands to navigate on the page. There are very special, interesting, weird, magical peripherals that some people use because they miss a hand or they have muscle deficiency, so they can't use mouses in the same way. So they'll just use it in a different way, which to us looks to us able-bodied people looks very interesting. But they can make it work. I know programmers who are both deaf and blind, and they still write software, and they make it work So yeah, there are many different ways that people browse and explore the web. And actually, there are very smart people who are always standardizing on this subject of accessibility and exposing accessibility to browsers and to browser agents, so that we can actually write software that can be experienced by, if not everyone, almost everyone.
Whoa. So this is the first time I've heard about screens with Braille. That's absolutely mind-blowing. I had no idea. I thought they just had like the Braille keyboards, but they actually have screens with Braille?
Yes, and it will literally raise up on the thing, and you can feel it on your fingers, and then you can read the screens. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
So do you have any idea why the captions for the screen reader or the screen reader voice would most likely not work for your voice? I know you can sing it, but
for my voice.
Like, do you have any ideas why?
Because you tried it? Is that what you did?
No, not yet.
No. So captioning, automated captions is what we're talking about, right? There is an interesting point when you're doing an accessibility audit that talks about transcribing and captioning videos. So if you have video content on your site, it is important that you always provide at least a transcript of that video, and preferably also captions. And so some people think, well, I'll just use automated software to caption my video and then I'm done. But in general, the majority of people that I know who do auditing on accessibility will say that is not good enough. Automated tools still cannot always pick up on differences in accents or jargon or domain words or words that sound the same but are different. French, I'm looking at you. You have a lot of words which are written differently but sound exactly the same, like murmur, 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 murmur. And thus, software can't always do these transcriptions automatically. And if you're relying on the automated subscription to provide the same value, then there is a 99.99999% chance that you're not going to be able to. And thus, if you have it transcribed automatically, you always need a human that actually checks that it makes sense. And then it's no longer automated. We're just not there yet, I guess. And I don't know if we're ever going to be, because there is so much nuance in voice that is very hard to capture by software.
Still a lot of testing to be done, probably.
Yeah. You see this a lot on YouTube. If you turn on automated captions and someone starts singing, as you just said, it will just stop captioning at some point because it won't be able how to do it, because it's trained on voice models and not on singy voices. So some people who have a very melodic voice, like I do, it will actually fill on captions every once in a while.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have another question in the chat from Melvin van Rookhuizen. How often do you test this with user groups? I can imagine for many developers, it's difficult to test live with real people. Is there an online tester community of some sort?
Yes. So there are various. I don't want to advocate for one. So I highly recommend you just type into Google, ik wil testen voor mensen met disabilities, and then whatever region you're in, because there are actually quite a few companies in the Netherlands who do this. But to answer your actual question, yes, it is very hard for developers to do this. However, testing with people with disabilities is no different than any other user test, which companies should be doing in the first place, but often don't. In my companies, what we generally do is we test our software when necessary, so when we're not confident, in 2 stages. We'll have a designer and UX team design the pages, And then we'll actually test with users how they respond to those pages. That's a regular user test. Has nothing to do with disabilities. But at that moment, we do the first test. We try to include people who are in our target audience, but are on the edges. So think of elderly when you're designing a product for primarily young people, or young people when you're designing a product for primarily older people, because a young person may be doing this for their grandma or grandfather, or a parent may be helping their kid. So you cannot say, oh, well, that's not my target audience, so therefore I don't need to test for it. Then we go through the development process, and we've been doing this for a while. So in general, we write software that is decently accessible, but then towards the end of the stage, we'll say, okay, we feel confident about this now. We're going to test with a group of people who are actually blind or actually deaf or actually have are not able-bodied in any way or form, and just tell us what you're having difficulty to use with. Now, we don't usually do this for static information pages because those are generally okay, but we do this for highly interactive components, which are harder to make accessible for everyone. The more interaction you have, the more things you need to think about. A very common mistake, GitHub, I'm looking at you, it took you a year to implement this after I raised this, having keyboard shortcuts that are just one key. But many people who use accessibility tools will have mapped their keyboard or whatever they're using to shortcuts. So they don't need to spend a long time navigating a page. For example, if you're using NVDA as a screen reader, there is a single character key that will go to the next heading or that will go to the next landmark. Therefore, just registering those keys to some function on the website is a no-no. You shouldn't do that. But when you're having a complicated component like a calendar, those are really good to test with actual users. And they can actually help you say, oh, well, if you told me what the shortcuts are before I entered a component, it would be very easy for me. Or, hey, it's actually the order of the component, the order of the elements in the component that is hard for us. And so you take that feedback the same way you would take feedback from a user who can see. And then we iterate on it. And then we do it again, unless we feel confident that we've done exactly what they say. In my experience, almost every company I've worked with that provides this have done a stellar job in the reporting department. So they will not just say it doesn't work. They will tell you what's wrong, how they cannot use it, and often they will even help you with suggestions, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for this, again, very important talk, DJ.
Of course. I'm glad you liked it. If you want more, feel free, anyone, to contact me on the Twitter sphere. I'm still on Twitter, even though Elon is destroying it. You can go on GitHub. You can ask Raita if you want to get in touch with me. And I was very happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, DJ.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So let's get ready for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Kilian Valkhof. Please join me on the stage.
Hi.
Hello, hi. So Kilian is founder at Polypane Browser for Developers, and we'll talk about forced colors. Or Windows High Contrast Mode is a way for browsers to completely override your website designs with a user-specified style. So the CSS media query of the same name can help you adapt or compensate for this radical change in your site's design. But what should you adapt to and how? Kilian, you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's right. But I do need my laptop, or are we just doing an introduction first?
No, we can definitely talk a bit about your talk and how
Sure.
And while we set up your laptop in between.
Yeah, sure. So forced color mode. is a feature that not a lot of people or developers know about, even though it's a very important part of the accessibility tooling that Windows provides. And actually a lot of people use it. I'll mention later on in my presentation as well. So it's good to know about, and it's also fairly easy, or it's not a lot of effort to adapt your website to work well with forced color mode. So it's something that's very nice for developers to do.
So as a developer or someone who is listening to your talk and who wants to become a more accessible developer and is just starting, asking for a friend, what exactly are forced colors?
Right. So I'll do a full introduction in my presentation, but the short answer is that forced color mode is a way for Windows to essentially override all the colors on every part of your device.
Yeah, got you. Well, thank you. Let's see, are we ready for Kilian's talk?
Oh. And we're back again. Right. Welcome everyone to Forced Colors Explained. Oh, mag ik daar staan? Oké, ga ik daar staan. Yeah, are we good to go? Cool. So welcome everyone. I'm here to tell you today, or talk to you today about forced colors, where it comes from, how it changes your website, and what you can do about that. So first off, I'm Kilian Valkhof. I'm a media query enthusiast. I've been writing about and giving talks about media queries essentially forever, all the way since they gained support in Safari 3 and Opera ages ago. I'm also the creator of Polypane, which is a browser for developers. If that interests you, please check it out at polypane.com. So back to forced color mode. Yes, it's another media query that you'll have to adapt to. It's also an operating system feature, and it's extremely useful for the people that use it. And making sure your site works well with forced colors is really not a lot of work. And on the web, that's a pretty good deal. So I hope by the end of this presentation, you have some concrete ideas to spend a little bit of time on your website to make it work really well for people that use forced color mode. So forced color mode didn't start as forced color mode. It started as something called high contrast mode in Windows 7 and IE 10. Nowadays, it's supported all the way up to Windows 11 and all the browsers. Now, with forced color mode, users can override all the colors across their entire operating system in one go. Now, the name for this is high contrast mode, but it's not really about contrast, which is weird because all the default themes that Windows ships for high contrast mode are all high contrast. But it's not really about the contrast. I'll explain later. High contrast mode severely limits the number of colors that your device uses. And it also lets your user pick the colors that are being used. Now, usually users will do is pick colors that are very high contrast, like white on black or black on white. They don't have to. They can adapt to whatever their own needs are. They can choose to avoid specific colors that don't work well for them. They can create something like a sepia theme, or they can actually configure their entire device to have less contrast. The main feature is really that it limits the number of colors on the screen, and it gives the user control of what those colors are. Now, for the rest of the talk, I will try to be intentional about when I use high contrast mode and force color mode, but in most situations, you can use them interchangeably. So who uses this? Well, many people do, because it's useful for a wide variety of situations. People with low vision, people who have color blindness, people prone to migraines or light sensitivity, but also people that use this feature to keep their screen readable when they are out and about in bright sunlight. Or they dim their entire user interface when they have to work in dark environments. Force color mode is one of the only features that will force the colors across the entire operating system UI and the browser. And it's that guaranteed change that makes it really useful for people. Because it means they can depend on the colors to be changed rather than any given developer implementing their own dark theme or not. Now, how many people use this? Well, in terms of numbers, Microsoft states that 4% of Windows users have this feature turned on. In the WebAIM Low Vision survey, 50% of people with low vision indicated that they use this mode as well. Of course, the people that fill in the WebAIM Low Vision survey and that have low vision are a very self-selecting group of very tech-savvy people. But with 4%, it still means that 1 in 25 people that visit your website have this mode turned on. So how do you use it? Let me walk you through the steps of turning on high contrast mode. I'm going to use Windows 10 because that's what I have access to. In Windows 11, everything is slightly differently placed and it has slightly different naming for reasons. But in Windows, the feature is called Ease of Access, and you can find it in the settings, indicated here on the screen. So when you click over to that, if you haven't ever looked around here yet, give it a look, because it actually gives you a lot of options to adapt Windows to your own needs. So for example, I have a slightly larger text size because the device I use Windows on, it has a very small screen. And this makes it really easy to do that. So for ease of access, there are 3 categories: vision, hearing, and interaction. And you'll find high contrast under the vision category. So if you click there, you get this little toggle. And with that toggle, you can turn on high contrast. And once you do that, you can also pick a theme on this same page. Now, there's also a shortcut you can use: left Alt, left Shift, and print screen. And this will toggle between no high contrast and the last selected theme. In terms of themes, Windows ships with 4. There's high contrast 1, high contrast 2, high contrast black, and high contrast white. Now, the first 3 are all light on black themes, and they only differ in the accent color they use. So it's green for 1, blue for 2, and teal for black. And then high contrast white is the only dark on light high contrast theme. So all of these are obviously high contrast. So why did I mention that it wasn't about contrast earlier if they're all high contrast? Well, it's because a user can change all the colors and they can create their own themes. So you can choose a color for text, links, buttons, the backgrounds, and when you apply that, you get to save it as your own theme and reuse that. So for testing, now that you know how to turn it on and off, does that mean that you have to turn it on for your entire device to test? Or how do you test it when you don't have a Windows device? Well, a year ago, my advice would have been get a cheap Windows laptop, or a crap top, if you will, to test with. And that's still a good idea because you don't just have to use that for forced colors, but you can also use it for general cross-platform testing. For example, I have a Surface Go tablet, which you can see on the screen here. It's a relatively cheap, tiny Windows tablet, but there are, of course, other low-end laptops you can get as well if you don't have access to a Windows device. However, in the past year, Chromium browsers like Polypane, Chrome, and Edge gained an emulation mode for forced colors. So this is really helpful for two reasons. One, you get to test it even if you don't have Windows. So it works on Mac and Linux as well, because it's built into the browser, not the operating system. And the second benefit is that only your website gets rendered in the high contrast mode or in the forced colors mode, instead of your entire device. And trust me, having your DevTools not be in high contrast mode is really useful when you're developing a site. In this emulation mode, you get two variants, depending on if you have a light or dark preferred color scheme set. So it doesn't give you control over how the theme looks, and you can't select one of the 4 themes I mentioned earlier. But the good news is that you shouldn't care about those specific colors. And having both a light and a dark version will let you test for things later on your website. And we'll discuss what those are. Now, in terms of browser support for forced colors mode, every evergreen browser on Windows supports forced color mode. So you can use it, you can implement it and be sure that your users will have support for it. Now, IE and Old Edge, as it's called nowadays, also support Windows High Contrast mode, but they use an outdated and non-standard syntax, and we won't be discussing that today. I'll share resources at the end of the presentation that go into the differences between the standards way, which is implemented in all evergreen browsers, and the Internet Explorer way of dealing with forced colors. Now that we know what forced colors are, we know how to activate it, and we know which browsers support it. But how does it work, actually? Well, it works by editing your CSS. When forced colors is active in the browser, all these styles on the screen get reverted to their initial value. So color, for example, for text becomes black, because that's the default style in your browser. And then it gets overwritten with the user theme colors. So anything that specifies a color, but also things that contain colors like box shadows, get reset. Background images, on the other hand, are preserved, except on links and form elements, including buttons, where they get removed. And that also includes gradients, because as far as the browser is concerned, gradients are images. The result is that all your styling gets removed and it gets replaced with a fixed number of colors. Furthermore, text that's on top of images gets a solid background, which is called a backplate, to force the correct contrast for that text. Now, forced colors does keep your images and your SVG icons intact, including the colors within them, because forced colors doesn't know whether or not that's part of the content. So for a quick idea, here's a comparison with an existing website. On the left, you can see the regular website, and then on the right with forced color mode on. Now, notice how backgrounds and colors have changed and disappeared, but the images still look the same. So before we move on to what to do with this mode, I first want to highlight 2 other similar features that browsers provide that more or less give the same benefit to users. First one is reader mode. Now, reader mode will extract and reformat the content on your page in a user-chosen theme. So a user gets to choose the font size, the colors, the font weight, and it discards your entire layout. It just takes the content, the article, and it shows that to the user in whatever way they want to read. Whereas forced colors will retain your layout as well as the content. The other one is prefers contrast. Now, prefers contrast is a media query that also works across all browsers. though right now only macOS has an actual operating system level setting for it that enables it. It's a way for users to ask for more or less contrast. And specifically in Mac, you can only ask for increased contrast, for more contrast. So though prefers contrast and forced colors are both about getting a certain contrast, the difference is pretty big because forced colors changes all your site's colors. While with prefers contrast, which starts with prefers, it means that it's your job to make sure of that. So with forced colors, your style gets completely overwritten. But with prefers contrast, the user indicates, or your visitor indicates, that they're probably okay with your styling, with your colors, with your choices, except they just want more or less contrast within those choices. Now, there's one part where prefers contrast and forced colors overlap, and that is with something called prefers contrast custom. Now, prefers contrast custom is designed to give you a hook for different media queries that all benefit from what the specification calls reduced visual complexity. Reduced visual complexity is having like less background images, less gradients, less fancy shadows, etc. Just less going on the screen. By having forced colors also trigger prefers contrast custom, you can use this one media query to target multiple instances and then use this specifically to provide reduced visual complexity. So moving on, back to forced colors. How do you know when your site is rendered in forced colors mode? And then what should you do with it? So first, the media query forced colors will be active when it's on, and it will be none when it's not on. You can forget about forced colors none because you probably don't have to ever do anything about that. But it's forced colors active that we're going to focus on for the rest of the slides. Now, what's interesting to know is that when forced colors is active, your browser will actually look at the background color that the specific theme has chosen. And if it's a dark background color, your browser will also turn prefers color scheme dark on. Whereas if it's a light background, your browser will turn prefers color scheme light on. So you can combine these two to figure out whether or not a user has forced color mode with a light on dark or a dark on light theme. That's useful for things like images, and we'll get to that in a bit. So great, we now know whether or not our site is active in forced color mode. And now what? Well, now we're going to test our site. We're going to open it up and look at it and just see everything that's wrong. So quick aside, you can actually see the DevTools in forced color mode here. See if you can still figure out what's going on there. What you want to do is go through your site and see all the changes that have happened. Figure out where colors are missing, where things became less clear because a bunch of stuff got removed. And we're going to improve that again. Now, it's important to know that the changes we're going to make are not about making the website look good again, because that's not the point of forced color mode. The point of forced color mode is to make sure that your site is as clear and readable as possible. So that's what we're working towards. We're not going to make it pretty again. We're going to make sure that all the content is as accessible as possible. Now, what we can see in this image here is that a lot of things that used to have borders no longer have, or have background images, no longer have backgrounds. This is because even though your regular site can use multiple different backgrounds, so you can use shading to differentiate different areas, in forced color mode, all the backgrounds become the same color. The way to deal with this is to add borders. And we can either add a border or an outline depending on what works for your current layout. Like if you add a border, your layout might break, so you can add an outline instead. Though keep in mind that you'll want to use the outline for focus modes as well. Now, one neat thing we can do here is for all the areas that used to be delineated by different background colors, you can add a border without specifying a color. So if you do a border one pick solid, what the browser then does for you is append current color to that. And that means that the border will get whatever text color is used in that specific element, whether it's a link color or a button color or a regular text color. It will just adapt to whatever the element needs. And this is what that looks like. On this site, I had 2 buttons that had a background image. They now have a nice border. And I had a header with a different background. And that's now neatly delineated by a line. So that's step 1. Go through your site, see which areas need a little bit more differentiation, and add those back in with borders or outlines. Secondly, we'll want to check for hidden content. In particular, SVG icons, because SVG icons are left alone by force color mode, because force color mode in your browser doesn't know whether an SVG icon is part of the content, and so should change colors with the content, or if it's just a graphical image that happens to be in SVG. So it leaves them alone, and we need to help the browser along and tell them what to do with each specific SVG. Now, even if your SVG uses the current color keywords, which should inherit the color used by the parent element, that won't always happen in force color mode because that current color doesn't always map for SVGs to the parent color. So we need to be very explicit. How can we be explicit about colors if we don't know which colors the user chose? Well, CSS has a solution for that, and it's called system colors. It existed in CSS 2, and it let you use all the colors Windows 98 came in. So that's gray, gray, also gray, and like 10 more grays. However, browsers haven't supported these in a long time. They still exist, but they don't actually map to anything the operating system does. And that's because when you give developers access to the precise colors that an operating system uses, those developers can use those colors to precisely create fake UI and trick people into doing things they shouldn't do. So browsers no longer support this for fairly good reasons. So what do we do if we can't use those colors? Well, in CSS 4, there's now new system colors, and these are specifically designed to work with forced colors. They also work without forced colors, and then they map to whatever the default style sheet of your browser is. But with forced colors active, they will map perfectly to the theme that the user chose. So for text, there's the keyword canvas text. For links, link text. For buttons, button text. So far, so simple. The background is called canvas. The button background is called button face. And there's also 2 styles for specifically highlighted text, so selected text. And we can use these in our style sheet to nudge the browser along. So for SVGs, what we'll want to do, by default, our SVG icons can just be canvas text, the text of regular, or the color of regular text. And then for links and buttons, we can help we can tell the SVG to use the link text and the button text respectively. Now, one thing you'll have to do is figure out if your SVG needs to update the stroke or the fill. And make sure to check if this catches all the inline SVGs and if you maybe need to tweak 1 or 2 individually. The next thing you want to do is figure out whether or not you have any colors that have meaning on your site. Because when you replace all the colors and they have meaning, you lose that meaning. Now, using just color to convey meaning is a WCAG violation, so you shouldn't do that anyway, but it's still something you have to check. Are there any elements that use color to convey meaning? Those need to be updated. common ones that I see a lot are using like a red and a blue border for form elements to indicate whether or not they're valid. If those colors are gone, your user is not going to be able to know whether or not their input is valid. So the right thing to do here is to add a shape like a check mark, or even better, a very clear error or success text. Just tell the user this email is invalid because it misses the .com or whatever. So this also makes your site better for the 96% of people not using forced color mode, and that means everyone wins. Next up, one I do have to mention is text in images. Check if your page does not use any text in images, because images are left alone, so they won't be converted to the user's theme. It can be very annoying. Of course, there are multiple issues with text in images. So the solution is very straightforward. Don't use text in images. Now, text in images aren't the only images that you have to check though, because you might also be using things like semi-transparent PNGs that you expect to be overlaid on a certain background color that now has changed. Or you might have external SVGs that you expect to use to have a certain color background as well. So for these, what you want to do is consider adding a dark and a light alternative. For images, you can use the picture element with different sources, and then the media attribute to set force color and reverse color scheme active. And for SVGs that you load in as images, because SVGs are also parsed by the browser, you can actually just add a style element in there and write some CSS with force color active to adapt the SVG. And your browser will automatically take care of that. So that's pretty neat. Lastly, it's time to tap through the page and make sure that focus is still clearly indicated. If you have disabled the outline in favor of your own nicer looking focus style with box shadow or whatever, remember that focus mode removes box shadow. So you have to turn outlines back on. Now, a simple way to deal with this is to replace the outline none that you add to your styling with outline color transparent. What this does is, for people without force colors, nothing changes. Whether or not the outline is invisible because it's not there, or it's invisible because it's transparent, it's invisible. So a regular user won't mind. However, force color replaces all colors. So if your outline color is transparent, it will become the text color. And that means that for force color mode, your outline is suddenly back again where the box shadow has disappeared, making it nicely visible again for people in force color mode without you needing any specific CSS or specific CSS to adapt to force color mode. Because this can just be in your regular style sheet. Replacing outline none with outline color can be done in your regular style sheet, and people with force color mode will still benefit from that. So to summarize, when adapting to force colors, you want to make sure that you add borders to compensate for backgrounds that are no longer there. You want to make sure that all your icons are visible and that they follow the theme, that they have the right color for links, for buttons, for text. You need to make sure that you don't convey meaning with color alone. Of course, you should always do that. You need to make sure that you replace or provide alternatives for images that don't work well with random background colors. And you need to make sure that a focus indicator is still visible for all focusable elements. But what if you need to disable force colors? What if you want to keep your colors? Because sometimes your colors are very important. Imagine that you're building a web shop and a user can pick out the color of a shirt, and now suddenly all those nice colored squares are black. They'll have a very bad time picking out the color they like. So for those situations, and really only those situations, you can use force colors adjust none. With force colors adjust none, you can turn off force colors for that element and all their child elements, and make sure that your colors are still being conveyed. So as I said, there are a few legitimate places where you can use this, but please make sure to use it as sparingly as possible and respect your visitors' choices as much as possible. So to be very clear, that means don't put it on the body element. And with that, we've explained forced colors. We now know what forced colors are, how to configure them, why they're used, which browsers support them, how to test them, how to make sure your site looks good with them, and also how to disable them when that's absolutely needed. If you want to reread everything I just mentioned, you can go to polypane.app/forced-colors. And thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this.
My pleasure. I hope you all learned something.
Yes, absolutely. Seems there's a lot we should take into account to build a successful website. So, what for you? Can you give an example of a website that basically has it all? Like this is the perfect example. If I want to build one that's like incredibly accessible, this would be like the perfect example. Or there are just too many, or just like not enough. I mean, when is it good enough?
That really depends on your target audience. As DJ just mentioned, user testing is very important. You can never be 100% accessible for 100% of the people. So that's not something you should strive for, because that's going to be a never-ending story. But I hope with what I've just shown that specifically for forced color mode, it's actually not a lot of work to get that supported well for your website. You can probably do that in like half an hour. And like 1 in 25 people will have a good experience with your website. In terms of websites that do it really well, I don't have any examples right now that I can share. Sorry.
No, no worries. I thought perhaps you'd have like this example of this website who basically doing things right. So we do have another question from the chat, from DJ actually. Do you have any idea how many sites implement reverse contrast?
So support for reverse contrast has landed like in the past half year. And there's just the macOS increased contrast option. So I doubt many use it. Many websites use it yet. Personally, I also think that prefers contrast less is kind of a strange value. Like who's looking at their web or at their device and says, you know what, this would be better if I could see everything just slightly less clear. So we'll see how adoption goes. If you look at the other prefers media queries like prefers reduce motion, prefers color scheme, they all have relatively low adoption. And I think part of that is just people don't know about that, but also can take quite a lot of effort to implement that well. If you have a website and that has been designed, usually that has been like a very long project to get the right design, to get everyone to agree on it. So if you then go like halfway in that process, you say, you know what, let's make a version that's exactly this, but has like 50% more contrast. That's a very hard sell for, I think, a lot of companies. Same with, like, we have this design and it's in light mode now. Let's also design and implement a dark mode. You know, that it doubles the effort in for your website. And I think for a lot of companies, that's just not really possible to do. So I hope that people will pick up small things here and there to make it easier to adapt to these prefers media queries, rather than them having to be like implemented from the ground up. So like take small things here and there and implement that as you build, rather than set out and say, we're going to make the entire website work with prefers more contrast, and we're going to create a new design for that.
Do you think that in the future there will be more, well, not rules, but some regulations and guidelines on how to build a more accessible website?
Yeah, and I think DJ also touched on that. Whether or not that is going to be very prescriptive on, you have to support force colors, you have to support a light and a dark mode, you have to support this and that. I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, there is going to be more legislation, and it's going to be about making the content and the interactions accessible, so that everyone has equal access, though maybe not equal experience.
Yeah. So then even the smaller companies should invest in, well, spending more effort in building more accessible websites.
Yeah.
So hire more developers, perhaps?
Well, hire more developers or start with accessibility earlier on in the process. The earlier you take it into account, the easier it becomes. If the designer already checks all their contrast before giving the design to a developer or presenting it to the client, that saves a lot of work, like at the end of the process. Because if you implement all the colors and then you have to re-implement all the colors, that's twice the work. Whereas if you do it right the first time, you only have to do it once.
Yeah.
So it's all about education and making sure that you start with accessibility in mind, rather than seeing it as something you need to add to a website.
Yeah. And what are the target contrasts for more and less, or are there no guidelines at all?
So for force colors mode, you shouldn't care, because the user decides what their preferred contrast is. For regular designs, there are 2 levels, AA and AAA. For AA, you will want regular text to be the contrast of 4.5 to 1 using the WCAG algorithm. And for headers, you can go slightly lower with 3 to 1. And then if you want AAA, that goes to a 7 to 1 ratio for text and a 4.5 to 1 ratio for headings. Now, if you want to calculate that, you can go to polypane.app/contrast-checker. And I've built a contrast checker for you where you can toggle between AA and AAA, enter your colors, and then if there isn't enough contrast, we'll suggest a color for you. So if you have a text color that doesn't have enough contrast, we'll give you like a slightly dark or a slightly lighter text color that does have enough contrast.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you please repeat where we can find you if we might have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, you can find me at KilianValkhof.com or as @KilianValkhof on Twitter, and you can find Polypane at polypane.com.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. And I think we've reached the end of our mini summit. And our next event will be all about accessibility testing tools and practices as well. So you can check back on our website, techally.dev, and there are more details to follow soon. Thank you so much for being here, Kilian.
My pleasure.
And for now, we'd like to wish you wonderful, wonderful holidays in case you're celebrating. Please keep safe and warm without ruining the planet. and a very good start to the new year. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time. Bye.